The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle, as Prince William stood at the window of his private study, his hands clasped behind his back. The weight of recent months pressed heavily on his shoulders, and the silence in the room felt different now, charged with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Catherine entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea, her movements graceful despite the exhaustion that had become their constant companion. "The children are asking questions again," she said softly, setting his cup on the antique desk that had belonged to his great-grandfather. "George wants to know why everything feels different at home." William turned to face his wife, seeing in her eyes the same mixture of determination and vulnerability that had drawn him to her all those years ago at St. Andrews University. They had weathered many storms together, but this felt different. This wasn't just another royal crisis or media frenzy. This was about fundamentally reimagining their entire approach to royal life. The conversation that had been building for months finally came to the surface during those quiet evening walks around their Anmere Hall estate. Away from the protocols and the ever-present staff, they had begun to voice thoughts that felt almost revolutionary within the context of their roles. What if they could strip away the layers of tradition that no longer served a purpose? What if they could build something new while honoring the essence of what the monarchy represented to people? Catherine had been the first to suggest they needed to start completely fresh. She had watched William struggle with the inherited expectations, the rigid schedules, and the distance that royal life seemed to demand from real human connection. "We're losing ourselves," she had told him one evening as they sat by the fire. "And if we lose ourselves, how can we serve anyone else?" The idea terrified and exhilarated them both. Starting from scratch meant questioning everything, from how they raised their children to how they engaged with their charitable work, from their public appearances to their private family time. It meant potentially disappointing people who expected them to follow established patterns, but it also meant the possibility of creating something authentic and meaningful. William had spent sleepless nights thinking about his mother's legacy and how she had tried to modernize royal engagement with the world. Diana had shown that royalty could be both dignified and deeply human, but the system had pushed back against many of her innovations. Now, decades later, the world had changed dramatically. Social media had transformed how people connected with public figures. Younger generations expected transparency and authenticity, and the very concept of deference to authority was evolving. Their first step was to gather a small group of trusted advisors, not the traditional courtiers who had served the royal family for generations, but fresh voices from different backgrounds. They wanted perspectives from educators, social workers, technology experts, and young people who could help them understand what modern royal service could look like. The meetings were unlike anything that had ever taken place within royal circles. Instead of formal presentations and protocol-heavy discussions, they sat in circles, asked direct questions, and encouraged challenging ideas. Catherine found herself energized by these conversations in a way she hadn't felt in years. Here was space for creativity, for innovation, for the kind of work that could genuinely make a difference. One particular evening stands out in their memory. They had invited a group of young activists and social entrepreneurs to dinner, not a formal state dinner, but a simple meal around the kitchen table at Kensington Palace. The conversation flowed freely, touching on everything from mental health awareness to environmental action to the role of technology in building community connections. A young woman named Sarah, who had started a nonprofit focused on youth empowerment, looked directly at William and said, "Your Royal Highness, with respect, people my age don't care about titles and ceremonies. We care about action. We want to see that you understand our struggles and that you're willing to get your hands dirty working alongside us." The directness of her words might have offended traditional royal sensibilities, but William found himself leaning forward, genuinely curious. "Tell me more about what that would look like," he responded. That conversation became a turning point. They began to envision a new model of royal engagement, one that was less about being seen and more about truly seeing others. Instead of brief, carefully choreographed visits to organizations, what if they committed to longer-term partnerships? What if they learned skills that would make them genuinely useful in the work they were supporting? Catherine had always been passionate about early childhood development, but her involvement had been largely ceremonial. Cutting ribbons, giving speeches, and lending her name to causes. Now she began imagining what it would be like to actually train as a family support worker, to spend weeks learning directly from professionals in the field, to understand the complexities and challenges from the inside out. The resistance they encountered was immediate and intense. Senior palace officials were horrified by the suggestion that members of the royal family might engage in anything resembling ordinary work. The security implications alone were staggering, they argued. The constitutional questions were unprecedented. The risk to the dignity and mystique of the monarchy was unacceptable. But William and Catherine had reached a point where preserving the status quo felt more dangerous than embracing change. They had seen the declining relevance of royal institutions around the world, the growing questions about the value of monarchy in democratic societies, and the disconnect between royal life and the experiences of ordinary citizens. Their children became both their greatest motivation and their greatest concern in this process. George, Charlotte, and Louis were growing up in a world that would be radically different from the one that had shaped previous generations of royals. How could they prepare their children for roles that didn't yet exist? How could they give them a sense of purpose and identity that would serve them well regardless of how the monarchy evolved? They decided to start with small experiments. Instead of the traditional summer holiday at Balmoral, they spent 2 weeks volunteering with a disaster relief organization, bringing the children along to help in age-appropriate ways. Instead of formal state dinners, they hosted community meals for local families struggling with food insecurity. Each of these experiences taught them something new about themselves and about the potential for their roles to evolve. They discovered that, stripped of the formal protocols and elaborate settings, they could connect with people in ways that felt genuine and meaningful. They also discovered that this kind of engagement was far more demanding, emotionally, physically, and intellectually, than traditional royal duties. The learning curve was steep. William found himself fumbling with tools during a community-building project, his hands soft from a lifetime of white gloves and handshakes rather than manual labor. Catherine struggled with the emotional toll of hearing stories of hardship and trauma without the buffer of formal distance that royal protocol typically provided. But something was awakening in both of them. A sense of purpose that went beyond obligation or duty. They were beginning to understand what it might mean to serve not as figureheads or symbols, but as genuinely useful members of their community. The media reaction was predictably mixed. Some praised their efforts as long overdue modernization, while others criticized them for abandoning royal dignity and tradition. The tabloids had a field day with photos of William getting his hands dirty, or Catherine looking exhausted after a long day of direct service work. But perhaps most importantly, they were getting feedback from the people they were working alongside, and that feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Community workers appreciated having royal support that felt real and sustained rather than ceremonial. Young people responded to their willingness to learn and make mistakes rather than maintaining a facade of perfection. As the first phase of their experiment drew to a close, William and Catherine found themselves sitting once again in that study at Windsor Castle. But this time, the silence felt different, pregnant with possibility rather than heavy with uncertainty. They had taken the first steps toward answering the question of what royal service could look like in the 21st century. "The children seem happier," Catherine observed, and William nodded. George had started talking about the friends he had made during their volunteer work with an enthusiasm he rarely showed for traditional royal engagements. Charlotte had begun asking thoughtful questions about why some families had more resources than others, and Louis had adapted to the less formal routine with typical childhood resilience. They were far from having all the answers, but they had proven to themselves that change was possible. The next phases of their journey would require even greater courage and creativity, but they were no longer working from a place of obligation alone. They were working from a growing understanding of what it meant to build something meaningful from the ground up. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with potential obstacles and resistance from those invested in preserving traditional approaches. But for the first time in years, both William and Catherine felt energized by the possibilities rather than weighed down by the expectations. They were ready to continue building their new chapter, one genuine connection at a time. The September rain drummed steadily against the windows of the converted classroom, where Catherine sat cross-legged on a child-sized chair, completely absorbed in assembling a wooden puzzle alongside 4-year-old Emma. 6 months into their radical reimagining of royal service, Catherine had enrolled in a formal early childhood development training program, spending 3 days a week learning alongside career nursery workers and family support specialists. "You're getting much better at this, Catherine," said Maria, the lead instructor, as she observed Catherine's patient interaction with the children. The informality still felt strange to both of them. No, "Your Royal Highness," no curtsying. Just first names and honest feedback about her developing skills in child development and family support work. This particular morning was challenging Catherine in ways she had never expected. Emma, whose family was going through a difficult divorce, had been acting out all week, throwing toys, refusing to participate in group activities, and clinging desperately to any adult who showed her attention. Traditional royal training had never prepared Catherine for moments like this, where protocol was useless and only genuine human connection mattered. "Sometimes she reminds me of George when he was struggling with all the attention after my father-in-law's coronation," Catherine confided to Maria during their break. It was the kind of personal sharing that would have been unthinkable in formal royal settings, but here it felt natural and helpful. Meanwhile, across London, William was having his own transformative experience. He had begun training as an emergency responder, spending early mornings learning proper techniques for crisis intervention and community emergency response. The physical demands were intense for someone accustomed to the largely ceremonial aspects of royal life, but the mental challenges proved even more significant. "Your instinct is still to try to solve everything with words," observed Jack, his training supervisor, after a particularly difficult simulation involving a family domestic crisis. "Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is just be present and listen." This feedback echoed conversations William had been having with his therapist, sessions that had become essential as he navigated the psychological challenges of completely restructuring his approach to his role and his life. The process of letting go of ingrained patterns of behavior and thinking was proving more difficult than either he or Catherine had anticipated. Their marriage was also undergoing significant changes. The shared project of reimagining their roles had brought them closer in some ways, but the stress and uncertainty were testing their relationship in new ways. They found themselves having arguments about decisions that would have been made by royal protocol in the past. Should they accept a particular invitation? How much of their children's lives should be visible to the public? How do they balance their desire for authentic engagement with their security needs? One particularly tense evening, they found themselves in a heated discussion about Charlotte's education. Catherine wanted to explore alternative educational approaches that emphasized emotional intelligence and community engagement over traditional academic achievement. William worried about preparing their daughter for the realities of her future royal responsibilities. "We can't just pretend the system doesn't exist," William said, pacing around their private sitting room. "Charlotte will need to understand protocol, history, diplomacy, all the things that have been part of royal education for generations." "But what if those things aren't what matter anymore?" Catherine responded. "What if teaching her empathy and practical skills and how to connect with people authentically is more important than teaching her how to curtsy properly?" These conversations often lasted late into the night, sometimes ending in frustration but increasingly leading to new insights about their evolving roles as parents and as royals. They were discovering that starting from scratch meant questioning assumptions they didn't even know they had. Their experimental approach was also creating ripple effects throughout their extended royal duties. The traditional royal calendar, carefully planned months in advance, kept conflicting with their new commitments to sustained community engagement. They found themselves having to choose between long-standing ceremonial obligations and the deeper work they were trying to build. One such conflict arose when a major state dinner conflicted with the graduation ceremony for Catherine's child care training program. Royal protocol demanded her attendance at the state dinner, but missing the graduation felt like abandoning the commitment she had made to her fellow students and the families they served together. "They'll never understand," sighed Sir Christopher, their longest-serving private secretary, when Catherine expressed her desire to prioritize the graduation ceremony. This could be seen as a serious breach of royal duty. But Catherine had learned something important during her months of training. Sometimes doing the right thing meant disappointing people who expected you to prioritize their definition of importance over your own understanding of what mattered. She attended the graduation ceremony, and the photos of her celebrating alongside working parents and career childcare workers generated more genuine positive response from the public than most formal royal events. People seemed to respond to the authenticity of her joy and pride in completing something genuinely challenging rather than simply appearing at another ceremonial function. William was facing similar conflicts in his emergency response training. A traditional royal engagement in Scotland conflicted with a critical assessment that would determine whether he could advance to the next level of certification in crisis intervention. The symbolic importance of the Scottish engagement was significant. It was connected to his role as Duke of Rothesay and had implications for royal relationships with Scottish communities. But William realized that constantly choosing symbolic obligations over substantive development was exactly the pattern they were trying to break. He missed the engagement and took his assessment, passing with scores that reflected months of serious study and practical application. The criticism was immediate and intense. Newspaper editorials questioned whether the royal family was abandoning its fundamental responsibilities. Some political figures suggested that if royals wanted to do normal jobs, perhaps they should give up their royal privileges entirely. But mixed with the criticism came unexpected support. Veterans groups praised William's commitment to developing real skills in emergency response. Child advocacy organizations celebrated Catherine's dedication to professional development in early childhood services. Young people, in particular, seemed energized by seeing royals willing to be students again, rather than always being in positions of authority. The children were adapting to their parents' new routines with typical childhood flexibility, but the changes were significant for them too. George had started attending a more diverse school, where his classmates' families included emergency workers, teachers, social workers, and small business owners, rather than primarily aristocrats and wealthy professionals. "Dad, why do some kids at school not know who you are?" George asked one evening during dinner. It was a simple question that opened up complex conversations about privilege, responsibility, and identity. Charlotte, always observant, had noticed the difference in how people responded to their family during their community engagement work versus traditional royal appearances. "People seem happier when we're helping with actual work," she observed with 6-year-old directness. These insights from their children often proved more valuable than formal feedback from royal advisors. The kids were experiencing firsthand the difference between authentic connection and performative interaction, and their responses were helping guide their parents' evolving approach. By autumn, William and Catherine had completed their initial training programs and were ready to take on more substantial independent responsibilities in their chosen areas. Catherine was qualified to work as a family support worker, while William had earned certification as a community emergency response coordinator. They decided to take on their first major joint project, establishing a family crisis support center in an underserved area of London. Unlike traditional royal patronages, this would involve them in hands-on development, fundraising, staffing, and day-to-day operations. The project would test everything they had learned about working collaboratively, rather than simply lending their names and prestige to causes. They would need to work alongside community leaders, social workers, local government officials, and families in crisis to create something genuinely useful rather than symbolically impressive. The location they chose was deliberately challenging, an area with high unemployment, inadequate social services, and significant immigrant and refugee populations. It was exactly the kind of community that had been underserved by traditional charitable approaches and would require sustained, practical engagement rather than ceremonial support. Their first community meetings were eye-opening. Residents were skeptical about royal involvement, having experienced previous initiatives that generated publicity for the organizers but little lasting benefit for the community. William and Catherine found themselves having to prove their commitment through consistency and competence, rather than relying on deference to their titles. "We need to see that you'll still be here when the cameras are gone," said Amara, a young mother who had become an informal community spokesperson. "We've had politicians and celebrities come through here promising to help, but when things get difficult or boring, they disappear." This feedback was sobering but valuable. It reinforced their understanding that authentic service required persistence through challenges and setbacks, rather than just showing up for successful moments. As winter approached, they faced their biggest test yet, their first major crisis situation. A fire in a local apartment building left several families homeless just as temperatures were dropping. The crisis support center wasn't officially open yet, but the community looked to them for immediate practical help. What happened next would determine whether their months of training and preparation had genuinely prepared them for real service, or whether they would fall back on traditional royal responses of expressing sympathy and writing checks. The answer would reveal how much they had truly changed, and how much they were capable of changing. The smoke was still rising from the charred remains of Millfield Gardens apartment building when Catherine's phone rang at 5:47 a.m. It was Amara, the community leader, who had challenged them months earlier about their commitment to staying when things got difficult. Her voice was steady but urgent. "Catherine, we need you here, not as a royal, but as someone who knows how to help families in crisis." By 6:30 a.m., both William and Catherine were on site, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of arriving with security details and media escorts, they came in Catherine's personal car, wearing work clothes, and carrying supplies they had gathered from their own emergency response kits. The families who had lost their homes were gathered in the community center, and children were crying while parents tried to figure out what came next. Catherine's months of family support training immediately proved their worth. While local officials were still organizing formal emergency response protocols, she was already sitting with individual families, helping them assess their immediate needs and connecting them with resources. Her training had taught her to focus on practical necessities first: medication, identification documents, children's comfort items, and immediate safety concerns. Mrs. Hassan needs her diabetes medication from the pharmacy, but she lost her prescription cards. Catherine quickly reported to William, who was coordinating with local emergency services. "The Kowalski family has a baby who needs formula, and Mr. Chen is worried about his elderly mother who lives on the 4th floor but hasn't been accounted for yet." William's emergency response training kicked in as he worked with firefighters and local officials to ensure everyone was safely evacuated and accounted for. But his role was different from what anyone expected. Instead of providing symbolic comfort from a distance, he was actively participating in the practical work of crisis response. The next 72 hours tested everything they had learned about authentic service versus performative charity. Traditional royal protocol would have involved expressing sympathy, making a significant financial donation, and perhaps visiting briefly to show concern. Instead, they found themselves sleeping on air mattresses in the community center, taking shifts to help families navigate emergency housing applications, and learning firsthand about the gaps in social services that made crisis recovery so difficult. "I had no idea how complicated it was to replace identification documents," William confided to Catherine on their second night, as they sat exhausted in the community center kitchen. "Mr. Creston, Singh needs his ID to access his bank account, but he needs proof of address to get his ID replaced, and his proof of address burned in the fire." These weren't the kinds of problems that could be solved with royal influence or charitable donations. They required understanding bureaucratic systems, knowing which officials to contact, and having the persistence to follow up on applications and appeals. William found himself spending hours on hold with government offices, using skills he had never needed before but that were essential for effective crisis support. Catherine discovered that her ability to connect with traumatized children was being tested in ways her training had prepared her for, but that still felt overwhelming. 8-year-old Hassan kept asking when he could go home to get his soccer ball, not understanding that there was no home to return to. 6-year-old Maria hadn't spoken since the evacuation, communicating only through drawings that showed houses surrounded by orange flames. "I keep thinking about Charlotte and Louis," Catherine shared with Maria, the childcare instructor who had come to volunteer. "How would I help them process this kind of loss? How do you explain to a child that sometimes bad things happen for no reason?" Working directly with trauma forced both William and Catherine to confront the limitations of their privileged backgrounds. They had never experienced housing insecurity, never worried about losing important documents, never faced the vulnerability that comes with sudden displacement. But their training had taught them that effective support wasn't about having similar experiences. It was about listening carefully, advocating persistently, and showing up consistently. The media attention was intense, but different from typical royal coverage. Instead of focusing on what they were wearing or protocol details, reporters found themselves documenting their actual work. Catherine helping a teenager fill out emergency school enrollment forms, William learning to operate the community center's industrial washing machine to clean donated clothes, both of them looking genuinely exhausted after days of intensive crisis response. Some coverage was critical, questioning whether this was appropriate work for members of the royal family. But increasingly, the story that emerged was about competence rather than symbolism. People could see that William and Catherine weren't just visiting the crisis, they were helping to manage it. The breakthrough moment came on the fourth day, when the complex emergency housing system threatened to separate the Hassan family. Bureaucratic requirements would have placed their teenage son in a different temporary housing facility from his parents and younger siblings, despite the family's obvious need to stay together during their recovery. Traditional royal intervention might have involved making phone calls to high-level officials to request special consideration. Instead, William and Catherine worked through the system step by step, learning the appeals process, gathering required documentation, and accompanying the family to meetings with housing officials. Your Royal Highness, we're not accustomed to having royal family members personally attending these administrative meetings, the housing official said awkwardly during their appointment. I'm here as Hassan family's advocate, William replied. The titles don't matter right now. What matters is keeping this family together. The family was eventually housed together, but not because of royal influence. They succeeded because William and Catherine had done the practical work of understanding and navigating the system, work that any effective advocate could do with proper training and persistence. This experience became a turning point in how they understood their evolving roles. They realized that their most valuable contribution wasn't their status or their ability to write large checks, but their willingness to develop genuine expertise in areas where help was needed. Word of their hands-on crisis response work spread throughout London's social services networks. Other community organizations began reaching out not for traditional royal patronage, but asking if William and Catherine might be interested in learning about different types of community support work. We have a domestic violence support program that could use someone with crisis intervention training, said Dr. Sarah Williams, who ran a women's shelter. Would you be interested in shadowing our staff to learn how we help families escape dangerous situations? Our youth homelessness program needs advocates who understand how to work with government housing departments, added James Chen from an organization serving unaccompanied minors. Your experience helping families navigate emergency housing could be really valuable here. These invitations represented exactly the kind of authentic service they had been working toward, opportunities to contribute based on their developing skills rather than their inherited status. But each new area of work required additional training, more time away from traditional royal duties, and continued resistance from those who preferred more conventional royal engagement. The challenge of balancing their growing community commitments with their royal obligations was becoming increasingly complex. Their private secretary had compiled a list of traditional engagements they had declined or postponed, and the pressure from senior palace officials was mounting. Their Royal Highnesses are developing a reputation for being unreliable, complained Sir Hamilton, a senior courtier, during a particularly tense staff meeting. We have obligations to Parliament, to the Commonwealth, to institutions that depend on royal patronage. This community work is admirable, but it cannot come at the expense of constitutional duties. Catherine and William found themselves having to articulate a vision of royal service that hadn't existed before, one that prioritized deep, sustained engagement over broad, ceremonial coverage. They were arguing for quality over quantity, expertise over visibility, long-term impact over short-term public relations. We can attend 100 ceremonial events and cut 100 ribbons, Catherine argued. But if we want to demonstrate that the monarchy has genuine value in modern society, we need to show that we can contribute real skills and sustained commitment, not just symbolic presence. Their children were watching these debates with growing interest. George, now old enough to understand some of the tensions, asked pointed questions about the purpose of traditional royal events. Why do people want you to come cut ribbons when you could be helping families instead? He wondered. Charlotte had begun including crisis response scenarios in her imaginative play, setting up elaborate games where her toys had to help each other through emergencies. Someone has to be the person who knows how to help, she explained when asked about her games. The children's responses reinforced William and Catherine's growing conviction that they were moving in the right direction. Even when facing institutional resistance, they were raising children who understood service as action rather than appearance, and that felt more important than maintaining traditional royal protocols. As autumn turned to winter, they made a decision that would define the next phase of their journey. They would formally request a reduction in ceremonial duties to allow for increased community service commitments. They would ask to be judged on the impact of their work rather than the number of events they attended. The request would require approval from senior royals and government officials, and it would likely generate significant controversy. But after their intensive experience during the apartment fire crisis, they knew they had found their path forward. They were ready to argue for a new model of royal service, even if it meant challenging centuries of tradition. The mahogany table in the Windsor Castle conference room had witnessed centuries of important royal discussions, but the meeting scheduled for December 15th felt unprecedented. William and Catherine sat facing King Charles and Queen Camilla, along with senior palace advisors, constitutional experts, and government representatives. The proposal they were about to present would either revolutionize royal service or end their royal careers entirely. "Your Majesties," William began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was requesting. "Catherine and I are here to formally propose a new model of royal engagement, one that we believe better serves the British people while honoring the fundamental purpose of constitutional monarchy." The document they presented was the result of months of careful research and planning. They weren't simply asking to reduce their ceremonial duties. They were proposing a completely restructured approach to royal service that emphasized professional competence, sustained community engagement, and measurable impact over traditional visibility and symbolism. King Charles listened carefully as they outlined their vision. Having spent decades advocating for environmental causes and social justice issues himself, he understood their desire for meaningful engagement. But the constitutional implications of their proposal were complex and potentially problematic. "The concern," explained Sir Edward, the principal private secretary, "is that this approach could fundamentally alter public perception of what the royal family represents. The monarchy's strength has historically come from its symbolic unity and continuity, not from individual members developing specialized professional skills." Catherine had anticipated this objection. "With respect, Sir Edward, I think our recent experience suggests the opposite. People respond more positively when they see us demonstrating competence and genuine commitment than when we simply appear as symbolic figures." She presented data they had compiled from their community engagement work, feedback surveys from families they had helped, testimonials from social service organizations, and social media analysis showing significantly higher positive engagement rates for their hands-on community work compared to traditional royal appearances. "The families we worked with during the housing crisis didn't care about our titles," William added. "They cared about whether we could actually help them navigate emergency services and housing applications. That's the kind of service that builds genuine respect for royal institutions." Queen Camilla, who had spent years developing her own charitable expertise, asked practical questions about how they would maintain constitutional neutrality while engaging in direct social service work. "When you're advocating for individual families within government systems, how do you ensure you're not inadvertently taking political positions?" This question led to one of the most important parts of their proposal. They had developed partnerships with existing social service organizations that would provide oversight and guidance for their work. Instead of creating royal charitable foundations, they would work within established professional frameworks that had clear ethical guidelines and accountability structures. "We're not trying to become independent operators," Catherine explained. "We're trying to become useful team members within existing systems. The Red Cross trains volunteers in crisis response without expecting them to create their own disaster relief organizations. We want to follow similar models." The meeting lasted 4 hours, with detailed discussions about everything from security arrangements to constitutional precedents to public communication strategies. The most challenging questions came from government representatives who were concerned about the political implications of royals developing expertise in areas where government policy was relevant. "If Your Royal Highness becomes a recognized expert in housing policy through your crisis response work," asked the cabinet secretary, "how do you handle media questions about government housing decisions?" The traditional approach of royal neutrality becomes much more complicated. William had thought extensively about this challenge. We would focus our public comments on professional best practices and individual case advocacy rather than policy evaluation. It's the difference between saying this family needs help navigating the housing system and the government's housing policy is inadequate. The distinction was important but subtle, and it would require careful navigation. They were proposing to walk a line between meaningful engagement and political neutrality that hadn't been tested before in royal service. After the formal presentations concluded, King Charles requested a private conversation with just William and Catherine. The three of them walked through the castle gardens, away from advisors and formal protocols. "I admire what you're trying to achieve," Charles said as they paused by the rose garden that Diana had loved. "Your grandmother understood that the monarchy needed to evolve to remain relevant, and she supported my environmental work even when it was controversial. But what you're proposing goes much further than anything we've attempted." William looked at his father with appreciation for the support, but also with determination. "Dad, I've watched you spend decades trying to make a difference through traditional royal channels. You've accomplished important things, but you've also had to fight constantly against institutional resistance. We're not trying to abandon royal service. We're trying to make it more effective." Catherine added, "We've proven to ourselves that we can develop genuine expertise and make real contributions. The question is whether the institution will adapt to support this approach, or whether it will resist change, even when change could strengthen royal relevance." That evening, William and Catherine returned to their home at Adelaide Cottage, emotionally exhausted but cautiously optimistic. The conversation with senior royals had been more receptive than they had expected, though they knew that getting approval would require navigating complex institutional and political considerations. Their children greeted them with typical enthusiasm, full of questions about their day and eager to share their own experiences. Charlotte had started a project at school helping younger children with reading, inspired by watching her parents work with families in crisis. George had asked his teacher if their class could visit the community center where his parents volunteered. "It sounds like what you do is actually useful," George observed with 9-year-old directness, "not like when you have to go to those fancy dinners where you just sit and eat." These insights from their children reinforced their conviction that they were moving in the right direction. Their kids were developing an understanding of service based on action and impact rather than ceremony and tradition. While they waited for official responses to their proposal, William and Catherine continued their community work with even greater intensity. They had decided that the best argument for their new approach was continued demonstration of its effectiveness. Catherine had begun working with a team developing innovative approaches to supporting families affected by domestic violence. Her crisis intervention training proved valuable in helping women and children safely navigate the complex process of leaving dangerous situations. The work was emotionally demanding and sometimes physically dangerous, but it was also deeply meaningful. "I used to worry that royal attention might make domestic violence situations more complicated," confided Dr. Rahan, who directed the Women's Shelter program. "But Catherine has learned to work within our safety protocols, and her crisis intervention skills are genuinely helpful. The families see her as a professional ally rather than a celebrity visitor." William was developing expertise in emergency response coordination, particularly in underserved communities where traditional emergency services were often inadequate. He had begun working with local government officials to identify gaps in emergency preparedness and develop community-based response capabilities. The work was teaching them both that effective service required not just good intentions or generous funding, but sustained professional competence. They were learning skills that couldn't be delegated to staff or accomplished through symbolic gestures. Their relationship with traditional media was evolving as well. Instead of carefully staged photo opportunities, they began allowing journalists to document their actual work, including the failures and frustrations that were part of learning new professional skills. A documentary crew was given access to follow Catherine through a particularly challenging week, helping families affected by a school closure crisis. The footage showed her making mistakes, learning from more experienced colleagues, and sometimes struggling with the emotional demands of the work. "People keep asking if I miss the glamour of traditional royal events," Catherine told the documentary filmmaker. "But there's nothing glamorous about helping a single mother figure out childcare when her kid's school closes unexpectedly. It's just necessary work that someone needs to do well." The documentary, when it aired, generated more authentic positive response than years of traditional royal media coverage. People responded to seeing royals as competent professionals rather than distant symbols. By January, they received preliminary approval for a one-year trial of their proposed new approach. They would be allowed to reduce traditional ceremonial duties by 60% in order to increase their professional community service commitments. The trial would be closely monitored, and continuation would depend on demonstrable impact and maintained public support. The approval came with strict conditions. They would work within existing professional frameworks rather than creating independent royal programs. They would submit to regular performance evaluations by professional supervisors, and they would maintain absolute political neutrality in their public communications about their work. This is probably the most radical experiment in royal service since the monarchy became constitutional, observed Dr. Margaret Thompson, a historian who specialized in modern royal evolution. If it succeeds, it could provide a model for how hereditary institutions adapt to democratic societies. If it fails, it could call into question the entire future of royal relevance. William and Catherine understood the weight of the experiment they were undertaking. They were not just changing their own lives, they were potentially reshaping the future of the monarchy itself. But after months of experiencing the difference between meaningful service and symbolic appearance, they were ready to take that responsibility seriously. 18 months after their radical experiment began, William and Catherine found themselves in a situation they had never imagined, sitting in a parliamentary committee room, being questioned by MPs about the effectiveness of their new approach to royal service. The Constitutional Affairs Committee was conducting its formal review of their trial program, and the outcome would determine whether their revolution in royal service would continue or end. "Your Royal Highness," asked the committee chair, "can you provide specific examples of how your professional community service has produced measurable benefits that traditional royal engagement could not have achieved?" Catherine opened the folder she had prepared, filled with case studies and data from their 18 months of intensive community work. "Honorable members, I'd like to tell you about the Chen family, refugees from Myanmar who lost their home in a fire last winter." She described how traditional royal response would have involved a brief visit, a charitable donation, and perhaps ongoing patronage of a relevant organization. Instead, her professional training had enabled her to work directly with the family over 6 months, helping them navigate complex immigration requirements, access trauma counseling for their children, and eventually secure permanent housing. The family is now self-sufficient, the children are thriving in school, and Mrs. Chen has started a support group for other refugee families using skills she learned during her recovery process, Catherine explained. The impact extends far beyond one family because Mrs. Chen is now helping others navigate similar challenges. William presented similar case studies from his emergency response work, including his role in developing a community-based disaster preparedness program that had significantly improved response times and effectiveness in 3 underserved London neighborhoods. Traditional royal patronage might have involved supporting a charity that works on emergency preparedness, he explained. Instead, we've helped create a grassroots program that trains local residents to be first responders in their own communities. When the next crisis happens, these neighborhoods will be better prepared because residents have genuine skills rather than just external charity support. The questioning was rigorous and sometimes skeptical. Some MPs worried about the constitutional implications of royals developing professional expertise in areas relevant to government policy. Others questioned whether this approach was an efficient use of royal status and influence. "Wouldn't your time be better spent using your platform to raise awareness and funds for professional organizations rather than trying to develop your own professional skills?" asked one committee member. William had anticipated this question. "Honorable member, we've found that authentic advocacy requires genuine understanding. When I speak about community emergency preparedness now, I'm not just repeating talking points prepared by staff. I'm speaking from experience about what actually works and what doesn't. That authenticity makes the advocacy more effective." The most challenging questions came about their children's education and preparation for future royal roles. The traditional approach to royal education emphasized history, diplomacy, and ceremonial preparation. William and Catherine had chosen a different path, focusing on emotional intelligence, practical skills, and community engagement. "How are you preparing Prince George for his future role as king?" if he's spending time learning carpentry and community gardening rather than studying constitutional law and diplomatic protocol? Asked a committee member with obvious concern. Catherine's response reflected months of careful thought about this challenge. We believe that understanding how to connect authentically with people and contribute meaningfully to their lives is the most important preparation for any future royal role. George is learning empathy, practical problem-solving, and genuine service. Those skills will serve him well regardless of how the monarchy continues to evolve. The committee spent considerable time examining the security implications of their approach. Traditional royal security focused on controlling environments and limiting public contact. Their community service work required them to work in uncontrolled environments with unpredictable schedules and genuine proximity to the public. The security challenges have been significant, acknowledged Detective Inspector Williams, who had overseen the adaptation of royal protection protocols. But we've developed new approaches that maintain safety while allowing for authentic engagement. The key is that their Royal Highnesses have learned to work within professional safety frameworks rather than expecting special accommodations. Perhaps the most compelling testimony came from the professionals they had worked alongside. Dr. Sarah Chen, who supervised Catherine's family support work, appeared before the committee to describe her experience working with a member of the royal family as a professional colleague rather than a patron or figurehead. Initially, I was concerned about having Catherine in our program, Dr. Chen admitted. We worried about media attention disrupting our work or about having to provide special treatment that would compromise our professional standards. Instead, Catherine has become one of our most reliable and competent team members. Families request to work with her specifically because they trust her skills, not because they're impressed by her title. Similar testimony came from William's emergency response supervisors, community leaders who had worked with both of them, and families who had been helped by their direct service work. The data they presented was impressive. Over 18 months, they had contributed more than 2,000 hours of direct professional service, helped more than 150 families navigate various crises, and trained in 4 different professional specializations. Their traditional ceremonial duties had decreased by 60%, but measures of public approval for their work had increased significantly. The most important finding, explained Dr. Rachel Morrison, an independent researcher who had studied their approach, is that people report feeling more positive about the monarchy when they see royals demonstrating genuine competence rather than just symbolic presence. This suggests that professional service enhances rather than diminishes royal relevance. The committee's final questions focused on the broader implications of their experiment. If this approach proved successful, how would it be scaled to other members of the royal family? How would it affect constitutional relationships between the monarchy and elected government? How would it impact the role of the Commonwealth and international diplomacy? We're not suggesting that all royal service should follow this model, William clarified. Different members of the royal family will find different ways to serve effectively. But we do think our experience demonstrates that the monarchy can adapt to modern expectations while maintaining its fundamental constitutional role. Catherine added, "We've learned that authentic service requires real skills and sustained commitment. If the monarchy wants to remain relevant to people's lives, we need to be willing to develop genuine expertise rather than relying solely on inherited authority." The committee hearing lasted 2 full days with detailed examination of every aspect of their work. The final session included testimony from constitutional experts, historians, and public opinion researchers about the broader implications of their approach. 3 weeks later, the committee published its report with a recommendation that surprised even William and Catherine's supporters. Not only should their experimental approach continue, but the royal family should consider expanding similar programs for other family members who were interested in developing professional service expertise. The evidence suggests that professional royal service enhances public respect for royal institutions while providing genuine benefits to communities, the report concluded. This approach represents a promising evolution in constitutional monarchy that deserves continued support and careful expansion. The approval came with requirements for ongoing monitoring and evaluation, but it represented a fundamental shift in how royal service could be conceived and practiced. William and Catherine had successfully argued that the monarchy's future lay not in preserving traditions unchanged, but in adapting its service mission to contemporary needs and expectations. 6 months later, As they celebrated 2 years of their new approach, William and Catherine reflected on how completely their lives had changed. They were still members of the royal family, but they were also qualified professional social service workers who happened to be royals rather than royals who occasionally engaged in charitable activities. "Remember when you were worried about Charlotte's education?" Catherine asked William as they watched their daughter help organize a community garden project. "Look at her now. She's developing exactly the kinds of skills that will matter in whatever future she creates." George had begun volunteering with elderly residents at a local care facility, using carpentry skills he had learned to help maintain the facility's garden spaces. Louis, though still young, had become the family expert at organizing donation drives and understanding how community resources could be shared effectively. "They're learning that service means competence, not just good intentions," William observed. "That's probably the most important lesson we could teach them about royal responsibility." Their marriage had grown stronger through the shared challenges of learning new professional skills and navigating institutional resistance together. They had discovered that working toward common goals requiring genuine competence created deeper partnership than traditional royal duties ever had. The broader impact of their experiment was still unfolding. Other royal families internationally were beginning to explore similar approaches. Young people in Britain were expressing increased interest in royal institutions, seeing them as relevant to their own aspirations for meaningful service, rather than distant symbols of inherited privilege. "We still don't have all the answers," Catherine admitted as they prepared for another day of community crisis response work. "Every family we work with teaches us something new about effective service. Every emergency situation reveals more skills we need to develop." But they had proven something important: that hereditary institutions could adapt to serve contemporary democratic values without losing their essential character. They had demonstrated that authentic service required genuine competence and sustained commitment rather than symbolic gestures and charitable donations. As they headed out for another day of hands-on community work, William and Catherine knew they had succeeded in creating something genuinely new, a model of royal service based on professional expertise, authentic relationships, and measurable impact. They had started from scratch and built something that honored both the traditions they inherited and the needs of the communities they served. Their bold new chapter was no longer an experiment. It had become a new standard for what royal service could accomplish in the 21st century.